There is a show that has been canceled and brought back from the dead, sued over a parody song, had an episode banned for over a decade, had another episode pulled off streaming services after a real attack made a cartoon joke look like a prediction, had a real grieving family contact Fox and demand the entire show be taken off the air, and had its own creator, when asked to name his single biggest regret across 25 years of television, point to a 5-second joke from season 1. That show is Family Guy, and tonight you are falling asleep to it. Get comfortable, turn the lights down, because over the next few hours, we are going through every moment this show made that left a mark on the real world. The banned episodes, the pulled airings, the protests, the lawsuits, and the one admission the show made about itself that covered 20 years of the same mistake. Welcome to Red Umbrella. Let's begin. The song that made AIDS organizations protest Fox. There is a moment in season 4 of Family Guy that stops being funny about halfway through and becomes something else entirely. Not offensive in the way the show usually is, not shocking, not gross, not boundary pushing in the fun way Family Guy trained its audience to expect. Something quieter and stranger than that. A man is lying in a hospital bed. He has just received the worst news of his life. And standing around him in matching outfits, harmonizing in perfect 4-part barbershop style, is Peter Griffin and 3 other men, singing to him about how he has AIDS. The song is called You Have AIDS. It is catchy. That is the problem. Family Guy had been on the air long enough by season 4 to have developed a very specific identity. The show knew what it was doing with dark humor. It had already pushed into territory that made Fox nervous, already generated complaints, already been canceled once and brought back. The writers understood the rhythm of a joke that goes somewhere uncomfortable. Setup, escalation, the moment where you realize the show is not going to stop, and then the release when it finally does. That structure had worked for them over and over again across 4 seasons. The AIDS Barbershop Quartet was built on that same structure. The problem was that real people were watching it. The episode is called The Cleveland-Loretta Quagmire, and it aired in the summer of 2005. The main plot is about Cleveland discovering that his wife Loretta has been cheating on him with Quagmire. That storyline is its own mess of complicated feelings, but it is not what anyone remembers about the episode. What they remember is the cutaway. In the middle of everything else happening in the episode, Peter mentions that he has a talent for delivering bad news. The scene that follows is a cutaway, one of the show's signature moves, where the main story pauses and the show jumps sideways to illustrate whatever point a character just made. Peter brags that he is great at delivering bad news. Cut to a hospital room. A doctor cannot bring himself to tell a patient the truth about his diagnosis. The news is too heavy. The doctor does not have the words. So he calls in Peter and the quartet instead. They arrive in their matching outfits, they take their positions around the bed, and they sing. The lyrics spell out not just that the man has AIDS, but how he might have gotten it. The song speculates about dirty needles, about unprotected sex, going into specific detail that goes well past the point where the joke has already landed and keeps going anyway. The patient sits there in his hospital bed and takes all of it while the harmonies float around him. The show's writers defended it immediately after it aired. Their explanation was simple. The tastelessness was the joke. Peter delivering bad news through an upbeat song was already absurd. The fact that the bad news was AIDS made it more absurd. The contrast between the cheerful melody and the devastating diagnosis, that gap, they argued, was where the comedy lived. The joke was not about AIDS. The joke was about the insane wrongness of this being the way someone found out they had AIDS. That defense made sense on paper. It made considerably less sense to the organizations that started calling Fox the following week. AIDS Project Los Angeles was one of the first to respond publicly. Their executive director, Craig Thompson, went on record saying the joke was as appropriate as singing an upbeat song about breast cancer or leukemia, which is to say, not appropriate at all. He said it was inexcusable for Fox to air something that treated AIDS as a subject for casual entertainment. He used the word stigmatizes, and that was a specific and deliberate word choice, because by 2005, one of the central challenges facing AIDS awareness and treatment in the United States was getting people to stop seeing the disease as something shameful and untouchable. The stigma around AIDS had been killing people for 2 decades by that point, not just through the disease itself, but through the silence and shame it created around getting tested, seeking treatment, and talking openly about prevention. A barbershop quartet joke that speculated about needles and unprotected sex in a cheery melody performed in a hospital room for a dying man did not help with any of that. David Munar of the AIDS Foundation of Chicago offered a slightly more measured response. He acknowledged that the show might have been trying to use dark humor to highlight how inappropriate and dehumanizing it would be to deliver such news through a song. That reading, that the absurdity of the delivery was itself a comment on how badly society handles serious illness, how uncomfortable people are with telling hard truths, how we reach for anything other than direct, honest conversation when faced with something devastating, was generous, but not entirely unreasonable as a reading of what the joke was attempting. His concern was that the joke required the audience to do a significant amount of interpretive work to arrive at that reading, and not every viewer would do that work. Some people would simply hear a catchy song about AIDS and walk away thinking the disease had become casual enough to laugh about freely. That was the risk, he said. The show had taken it without apparently stopping to consider whether whatever comedic reward the joke offered was worth what it cost. Multiple AIDS service organizations contacted Fox in the weeks following the episode. It was not a small or quiet response. These were organized groups with real memberships, people who were living with the disease, people who had lost partners and parents and friends and siblings to it, people who had spent their entire professional lives trying to shift public perception of a condition that had already taken hundreds of thousands of American lives. AIDS had been a crisis in the United States since the early 1980s. By 2005, the country had been living with it for over 20 years, and the work of making it something that could be discussed openly and without shame was still ongoing, still fragile, still requiring constant effort from the people doing that work. The show had taken one of the most painful, ongoing realities in those communities and turned it into a song with rhymes and harmonies and specific speculation about how you might have gotten infected. Fox did not pull the episode. The show did not apologize. The writer's defense that the tastelessness was the point, that the joke was about the inappropriateness of the delivery rather than about the disease, remained the official position, and the official position never changed. What makes this particular moment worth sitting with carefully is not just the joke itself, but what happened in the years that followed it. The barbershop AIDS joke became one of the most referenced cutaway gags in Family Guy history. It showed up in conversations about the show for years after it aired. Clips of it circulated online as the internet made it easier to find and share individual moments from television history. It became, in a strange way, iconic, which is a word that usually carries positive meaning, but in this case simply means that a song informing a dying man of his AIDS diagnosis was catchy enough that people remembered it and passed it around for 2 decades. The song lodged itself in the cultural memory of the show in a way that most cutaway gags never do. Then, in season 19, which aired in 2020, roughly 15 years after the original episode, Family Guy returned to the moment. Peter, in a later episode, references the AIDS barbershop quartet and expresses something that lands close to regret. Not a full apology, not a scene specifically built around unpacking what the original joke had done or who it had hurt. A brief, passing acknowledgement that looking back at it, he at least knows what he did. It was the smallest possible gesture in that direction, but the fact that the show felt the need to make any gesture at all is genuinely interesting when you sit with it. The writers did not go back and revisit the JFK Pez dispenser joke in season 19. They did not return to most of the other moments that had generated controversy and backlash across the show's long run. They came back to this one specifically, which suggests that somewhere in the writing room, across the gap of 15 years, the AIDS barbershop quartet had been sitting differently than anyone involved expected it to when they first made it. The mechanics of why the joke bothered people more than many other Family Guy controversies are worth thinking through carefully. The show had done dark humor about serious subjects long before season 4. It had made jokes about death, about disease, about tragedy, about violence, about real events that had hurt real people. What made the AIDS song land differently from most of those was the specificity of it and the duration of it. Peter and the quartet did not just announce the diagnosis and move on. They stayed in the room. The song continued. The lyrics kept going into more detail. The patient had to absorb all of it while they stood around his bed and harmonized. The joke refused to be brief. And in that refusal, it started to feel less like a quick, dark jab and more like something being sustained. Something being done to a person who could not ask them to stop. Because AIDS carried, and in 2005, still very much carried, enormous emotional weight for enormous numbers of real people. The refusal to be brief transformed the nature of the joke in ways the writers may not have fully accounted for. A quick reference to AIDS in a passing joke is one thing. A full musical number with specific lyrics about needles and sexual transmission,
performed at length in a hospital room for a man lying there receiving the news, is another thing entirely. The difference between those two things is not just a matter of degree. It is a matter of what the joke is asking its audience to do, and for how long it is asking them to do it. The show had always operated on the belief that nothing should be off limits. That belief is not inherently wrong. Comedy has always lived in dark places, and the history of humor is full of examples of jokes about death and suffering and tragedy that produced something real and valuable, that helped people process impossible things, that said truths that could not be said any other way, that turned pain into something survivable through laughter. The belief that comedy can go anywhere, done right, is not an indefensible position. But creative freedom is not the same thing as creative wisdom. And those two things are not always in the same place at 2 a.m. in a television writing room. The AIDS Barbershop Quartet passed through a writing process. Someone had the idea, other people in the room responded to it. It was developed, scripted, recorded, animated, reviewed by the network, and cleared for broadcast. At every step of that process, there was an opportunity to ask whether the joke was doing what comedy can do at its best, using darkness to illuminate something, to say something true, to produce laughter that comes from recognition rather than from cruelty, or whether it was simply using the subject as fuel without giving anything back to the people for whom that subject was not abstract. The real-world response that followed the episode suggests the answer to that question was more complicated than anyone inside the process had anticipated. Seth MacFarlane has built his entire career on the conviction that comedy can go anywhere as long as it is honest about what it is doing. That conviction has produced genuinely brilliant moments across Family Guy's long history. It has also produced moments where the gap between what the show intended and what actually arrived in people's living rooms was wide enough to do real harm. The AIDS joke lives in that gap. The writers meant the absurdity. The AIDS organizations heard something that confirmed their deepest fears about how their community was being seen and treated by the culture around them. Both of those things can be true at the same time, without canceling each other out. The show intended one thing, and something else was received. That happens in comedy, especially in comedy that operates at the volume and speed that Family Guy does, generating episode after episode across decades, pushing limits so constantly and so relentlessly that the line between genuinely bold and simply careless begins to blur in ways that are hard to see from the inside. The AIDS Barbershop Quartet was not the last time Family Guy would blur that line. It was not even the most consequential time a joke left the show and landed somewhere entirely different from where the writers aimed it. __quote _1 __. That would come much later, in an episode that was not about a cutaway gag at all. It was about an entire subject so combustible that Fox refused to let it air in the United States altogether. And unlike the AIDS song, the network did not change its mind. Section 2, Quote 2, banned for 4 years and then sued. There is a version of Family Guy that most people never saw when it was supposed to air. Not a lost episode, not a rumor, not something that exists only in the memories of people who worked on the show. A fully finished, fully produced episode that sat on a shelf at Fox for 3 years while the network tried to figure out what to do with it. The episode had a song in it. The song had lyrics that Fox was not sure the country was ready for. And by the time the country finally did hear it, the song had already triggered a lawsuit that would take 4 more years to resolve. The episode is called When You Wish Upon a Weinstein. It was produced in the year 2000, intended for season 2. It did not air until 2003. And the story of why and what happened after is one of the clearest windows into the space between what Family Guy thinks it is doing and what the outside world sees when it watches. To understand the episode, you have to understand where Peter Griffin is at the beginning of it. He has lost the family's money. Not through some elaborate scheme or complicated series of bad decisions. He lost it because he fell for a scam. Volcano insurance. Peter paid for volcano insurance, which is not a real thing that anyone needs, and now the Griffin family has no money left. Lois is furious. Peter is embarrassed in the specific way that Peter gets embarrassed. Loudly, briefly, and without any real plan for what to do next. And so, being Peter, he starts looking for 2 things at once. Someone to blame and someone to fix it. His solution is to find a Jewish accountant. The reasoning Peter uses is built entirely on a stereotype. The idea that Jewish people are naturally better with money than everyone else. That this is simply a fact about the world, the same way gravity is a fact about the world. And that the logical response to a financial
financial crisis is to locate someone Jewish to handle it. He does not arrive at this conclusion through cruelty. The show is very careful and deliberate about how it frames Peter's ignorance. He is not a hateful person in the way that someone who knowingly embraces prejudice is hateful. He is a man who absorbs the worst ideas floating around in the world without ever stopping to examine them. He believes the stereotype because he has never once questioned it. He believes finding a Jewish financial expert will solve his problems because the idea fits neatly into the limited way he understands how the world works. And so he breaks into song. The song is called I Need a Jew, and it is sung to the melody of When You Wish Upon a Star, the song from the 1940 Disney film Pinocchio. The original song is one of the most recognized and emotionally loaded pieces of music in American popular culture. It is the song that plays when you think of Disney as a company and as an idea. It has been attached to moments of childhood wonder and innocence for generations of American families. It is the kind of song that lives in people before they are old enough to understand what music is, absorbed through cartoons and theme parks, and the particular magic that Disney built its entire brand around. Family Guy took that melody, kept its gentle rhythm and its feeling of earnest wishing, and filled it with Peter singing about needing a Jewish person to come handle his finances. The lyrics leaned into the stereotype directly, framed through Peter's cheerful and complete certainty that he was simply stating obvious facts about the world.
Seth MacFarlane's stated intention was satire. Not satire of Jewish people, satire of Peter's ignorance. The idea was that the butt of the joke was Peter himself, a man so dim and so unexamined in his thinking that he would hear a stereotype and treat it as reliable information, then build an entire plan around it. The gap between Peter's absolute confidence and the complete emptiness of his reasoning was supposed to be where the comedy lived. MacFarlane has explained this framing multiple times across interviews over the years. Family Guy, in his view, uses its characters' worst impulses as a mirror held up to real-world ignorance. The joke is never on the group being stereotyped. It is always on the character stupid enough to believe the stereotype. Peter's financial panic driving him straight to an ethnic assumption was meant to show the audience how hollow and absurd those assumptions are when you follow them to their logical end. Fox did not see it that way. Or more precisely, Fox was not willing to bet that the audience would see it that way. The network reviewed the finished episode and concluded that the satire was not clear enough, not signaled strongly enough, not protected enough from being read as the show straightforwardly endorsing what Peter was singing. They pulled it from the schedule without public explanation. No air date was announced. No statement was made. The episode simply did not appear when it was supposed to appear, and most viewers had no idea it existed at all. This was not a small decision. The episode had been fully produced, written, voiced, animated, scored, completed in every technical sense. Pulling it after all of that work had been done meant Fox was willing to absorb the entire cost of production rather than put the episode on air and deal with what followed. That is a significant choice for a network to make, and it tells you something about how seriously Fox took the concern that the material would land wrong. The episode eventually reached viewers through a different path. In September 2003, it appeared on DVD as part of a Family Guy box set, the first time most people could actually see it, not on television, but on a physical disc they had to go out and purchase. 2 months after the DVD release, on November 9th, 2003, Cartoon Network's Adult Swim programming block aired the episode on television for the first time. Adult Swim had been running Family Guy reruns for a period that had become genuinely important to the show's survival. The audience that built around Family Guy on Adult Swim was passionate enough and large enough that it became one of the reasons Fox eventually brought the show back after canceling it. The Weinstein episode aired on Adult Swim without triggering the catastrophic response Fox had feared. Fox themselves then aired it on December 10th, 2004. By that point, the episode had been sitting in various stages of unavailability for roughly 4 years. The critical response when it finally reached a broader audience was, in many ways, anticlimactic. A significant portion of viewers did not think it was the dangerous thing Fox had spent 4 years keeping off their air. The satire, for many people who watched it, was readable. Peter was obviously the fool. The episode went out of its way to present Max Weinstein, the Jewish accountant Peter eventually hires, as a completely normal and competent human being whose only unusual quality is that Peter treats him like a miracle. Max Weinstein was played by Ben Stein, a well-known Jewish public figure with a long career in film, television, and public commentary. Casting Ben Stein in the role was itself a signal. The show was not hiding the fact that it was engaging with Jewish identity, and it was engaging with it by giving the Jewish character in the story the most dignity of anyone in the episode. The subplot where Peter attempts to convert Chris to Judaism, believing that being Jewish will make Chris
Chris, more financially successful in life, is treated by the show as precisely as ridiculous as it sounds. Chris does not become more successful. Peter's theory is proven wrong. The stereotype leads nowhere. But the lawsuit that followed the episode's eventual airing had nothing to do with anti-Semitism. Bourne Music Company owned the publishing rights to When You Wish Upon a Star. They were the company that controlled the original song. And when Family Guy used that melody as the backbone of I Need a Jew, Bourne filed a lawsuit against Fox and Seth MacFarlane. The argument they made was specific and legally interesting. They were not simply arguing that Family Guy had used the melody without permission. Parody law in the United States has long allowed creators to use existing songs as the basis for new comedic or satirical works without needing the original creator's approval. Bourne's argument went further than that. They argued that what Family Guy had done to the melody was so offensive, so damaging to the reputation and feeling of the original song, that the fair use protection that normally covers parody should not apply. Their position was that attaching ethnic stereotypes in lyrics about Jewish people to one of the most wholesome and beloved melodies in American culture caused a specific kind of harm to the original, that anyone who heard I Need a Jew would forever hear something of it when they heard When You Wish Upon a Star, and that this association damaged the song in a way that went beyond what parody protection was designed to allow. It was a genuinely complicated legal argument, and not an obviously losing one. The fair use protection for parody in the United States is real, and it is broad, but it is not unlimited. Courts have recognized that parody can cause harm to original works, and have had to decide, case by case, where the line between protected commentary and actual damage sits. Bourne's lawsuit pushed on exactly that line. The case moved through the legal system slowly, these things always do, and it was not resolved for years. In 2009, a judge ruled in favor of Fox and MacFarlane. The ruling confirmed that I Need a Jew was a parody of When You Wish Upon a Star, that it used the original song as its target in the way parody law requires, and that the protection therefore applied, regardless of how offensive the new lyrics were. Bourne's reputational damage argument was not sufficient to overcome the legal protection. The full timeline of this episode is worth sitting with for a moment, because it is genuinely extraordinary for a 22-minute cartoon. The episode was written and produced in 2000. It was pulled from air before anyone outside the production had seen it. It sat on a shelf until 2003, when it appeared on DVD and then on Adult Swim. It aired on Fox in 2004. It was then the subject of an active lawsuit from 2004 through 2009, when a court finally cleared it. From the moment it was completed to the moment the last legal question about it was settled, 9 years passed. 9 years of uncertainty, legal proceedings, and public conversation about a single episode of an animated sitcom. What the Weinstein episode reveals about Family Guy's relationship with controversial material is something that runs through every section of this video. The show's standard defense, that the satire is aimed at ignorance, that the fool is Peter and not the group Peter is being ignorant about, that the joke is on the wrong thinking rather than on the people the wrong thinking is directed at, is not a dishonest defense. It is a real and historically grounded approach to comedy. All in the Family, which many television critics consider one of the greatest American sitcoms ever made, was built entirely on a character named Archie Bunker, whose bigotry was the subject of constant mockery. The audience was never supposed to agree with Archie. The audience was supposed to recognize his views as wrong and laugh at the gap between his certainty and his blindness. Peter Griffin and Archie Bunker are very different characters in very different shows, but they share a structural function: the person whose bad thinking the show is using to examine bad thinking. The problem that both shows face, and that Family Guy has faced more consistently than All in the Family ever did, is that satire only works when the audience understands which direction the joke is pointing. A joke that mocks a prejudice can only do that work if the person watching understands they are supposed to be laughing at the prejudice rather than with it. If a meaningful portion of the audience watches Peter sing about needing a Jewish accountant and comes away thinking the show is agreeing with Peter, that the stereotype is being presented as funny because it is true rather than because Peter is an idiot for believing it, then the satire has not done its job. The show can point to its intentions as much as it wants. What matters is what actually arrives in the room. Fox's concern in 2000, when they pulled the episode, was exactly this. They were not convinced the satire was clear enough to prevent a significant portion of the audience from reading it the wrong way. That concern was not unreasonable. The fact that many viewers eventually did read it correctly when it finally aired 3 years later does not mean the risk Fox identified was imaginary. There is one more thing worth noting about the specific choice of melody. When You Wish Upon a Star is not a neutral piece of music. It is one of the most emotionally weighted songs songs in American popular culture. A song that lives in people from childhood, that carries associations with innocence and wonder, and the simple belief that good things can happen if you want them badly enough. Using that specific melody, with all of that emotional weight attached to it, as the carrier for lyrics about ethnic financial stereotypes, was a deliberate, creative decision. The jarring contrast between the warmth of the melody and the content of the new lyrics was part of what made the joke work comedically. It was also part of why Bourne Music Company felt the song had been genuinely damaged. You cannot take something people love and attach something uncomfortable to it without the attachment going in both directions. The show understood that the contrast was funny. What it may have underestimated was how many people would feel that the thing they loved had been used as a vehicle for something they did not want to hear. The episode is easy to find now. It has been available for over 20 years in various forms. Most people who come across it today watch it as one entry in a catalog of hundreds of Family Guy episodes, without knowing about the 4 years it spent banned, or the lawsuit that followed, or the genuine legal question about whether parody protection covered what the show had done with a Disney melody. That context has faded. The episode has become normal through simple familiarity and availability. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously, and that gap would get wider. The next episode in the show's banned history was not a close call. It was not a case where Fox eventually relented and aired the episode after a few years. It was a case where Fox, Adult Swim, and every other broadcaster in the United States all said the same thing. No, not ever, not here. An episode that has never aired on American television, that was produced specifically for American audiences, that the show's own creator described as one of the most thoughtful things his writers had ever made, and that remains, to this day, unavailable to watch in the country where it was made. Section 3. Partial Terms of Endearment, the only episode that has never aired in the US. There is one episode of Family Guy that you cannot watch on Fox. You cannot watch it on Hulu, which is where the show lives for most American streaming audiences. You cannot find it on Adult Swim, which has aired some of the show's most controversial material without blinking. If you live in the United States and you want to see this episode, your only option is to buy the Season 8 DVD box set and watch it on a physical disc, the way people watched things before the internet made everything available instantly. The episode exists. It is finished. It was produced with a full cast, a full crew, multiple guest stars, a complete story, and a real point of view about a real subject. It just has never been allowed to air in the country where it was made. The episode is called Partial Terms of Endearment. It is Season 8, Episode 21, the finale of that entire season. Seth MacFarlane has described it as one of the closest things his writing team ever produced to a real, honest, grown-up episode of television about a real subject. He did not compare it to other Family Guy episodes when he talked about it. He compared it to All in the Family, the show from the 1970s that built its entire reputation on using the structure of a comedy to have genuinely serious conversations about genuinely serious things. That comparison was deliberate. MacFarlane was not saying his writers had made a funny episode that happened to be controversial. He was saying they had made something that he believed belonged in a different category from most of what the show produced, something with real weight and real intentions behind it. The writers were proud of it. The critics who eventually managed to see it mostly agreed that it worked, and Fox refused to air it. Adult Swim refused to air it, and it has remained on that DVD shelf for 15 years. The subject it tackles is abortion. The setup unfolds carefully and without rushing. Lois runs into an old friend from her college days, a woman named Naomi. Naomi and her husband Dale want to have a child, but have not been able to on their own, and they ask Lois if she would be willing to carry a baby for them, to serve as a surrogate mother, to undergo the medical procedure, to be pregnant for 9 months on their behalf so that they can have the family they want. It is a significant thing to ask of someone. Lois understands that. She thinks about it. Peter is against the idea from the beginning, uncomfortable in the particular way Peter gets uncomfortable when something requires him to sit with complexity for more than 30 seconds. Lois decides to help anyway. She goes through the procedure. She becomes pregnant. Things appear to be moving in the direction they were supposed to move. Then Naomi and Dale are killed in a car accident. Lois is now carrying a baby whose biological parents are both dead. There is no family waiting for the child at the end of the pregnancy. The people who wanted it, who asked for it, who specifically created the situation so that they could have it, they are gone. The legal and emotional and personal situation Lois is now in has no clean answer, and the episode does not pretend it does. What follows is the thing that made Fox decide the episode could not air. The show lets the question sit in the middle of the episode and examines it from multiple multiple directions. Peter, after crossing paths with a group of people protesting outside an abortion clinic, changes his mind and lands firmly on the side of carrying the baby to term. His reasoning is presented with the depth and rigor that Peter Griffin's reasoning always has, which is to say, almost none. He was moved by the protesters. He feels strongly about it now. He is certain in the way he is always certain about things he decided 30 seconds ago without examining. The show uses his certainty and the complete absence of anything behind it to make a point about the way people hold political positions on subjects that have never personally affected them. There is a specific exchange in the episode that illustrates this with unusual precision. Brian asks Peter what should happen in a situation where a woman becomes pregnant because she was raped. Peter's response is that maybe she should have thought of that before she asked him for directions. It is a Peter Griffin answer in every sense, completely disconnected from logic, revealing in its disconnection, accidentally exposing the full emptiness of the position Peter is holding with such confidence. The show is not making a joke about rape. It is making a point about Peter. It is showing what happens when someone with no real engagement with a subject holds a firm opinion about it, and what that opinion looks like when it is forced to respond to the most difficult version of the question it is supposedly answering. Lois is different. She is the one whose body is actually involved in this situation. She is the one who will be pregnant for 9 months, who will give birth, who will carry every physical and emotional consequence of whatever decision gets made. The episode keeps returning to that fact. Lois's uncertainty is not weakness. It is the appropriate response of someone who understands the full weight of what is being asked. The show gives her the space to be uncertain, to consider, to struggle, and then it follows her to a decision and does not look away from it. The episode ends with Lois making her choice. The show does not cut to a joke at the last moment. It does not find a way to resolve the situation that sidesteps what the episode has been building toward. The writers picked a side, and they let the story land there without softening it. Fox's response was to pull the episode before it ever aired. The announcement came publicly at San Diego Comic-Con in 2009, before Season 8 had even begun its run on television. The Family Guy team stood in front of their audience at one of the biggest entertainment events of the year and told them directly, "This episode exists. It is finished. It will not be on Fox, and we are not sure where or if it will air." Fox released a formal statement confirming that they fully supported the producer's right to make the episode and to distribute it in whatever way they chose. The network simply exercised its own right not to be the one doing the distributing. McFarlane's first reaction was calm. He had been in this position before, when You Wish Upon a Weinstein had been pulled before airing. That episode had eventually made it to television. The pattern, as he understood it from experience, was that Fox would get nervous, time would pass, the cultural temperature around the subject would shift slightly, and eventually the episode would air the way the Weinstein episode had aired. He said publicly that he believed Fox would come around. He believed the same process that had eventually put the Weinstein episode on television would eventually put this one there too. He was wrong. Adult Swim was the next option. Adult Swim had been the network that finally aired the Weinstein episode after Fox held it for years. They had built their identity partly on being willing to put things on television that other networks would not touch. They ran late-night programming specifically designed for audiences who wanted content that pushed past what daytime and primetime television allowed. If any American broadcaster was going to step up and air partial terms of endearment after Fox declined, Adult Swim was the most logical candidate. Adult Swim said no. Their spokesperson confirmed there were no plans to air the episode. No detailed explanation was offered. The network that had helped rescue Family Guy from cancellation, that had run its reruns for years, that had built a passionate audience for the show, that eventually convinced Fox to bring it back, they looked at a Family Guy episode about abortion and decided it was not something they were willing to put on American television. The silence from Adult Swim was, in some ways, more striking than the silence from Fox. Fox was a major broadcast network with advertisers and regulators and a family-friendly reputation to protect. Adult Swim was a late-night cable block that had aired considerably more extreme content than anything Family Guy typically produced. If Adult Swim was not willing to air it, the episode was not going to air. It aired in the United Kingdom instead. BBC 3 broadcast Partial Terms of Endearment on June 20th, 2010 in its regular late-night programming slot. Nearly 1 million British homes watched it on its first broadcast. The critical response in the UK was largely positive. Reviewers noted that the episode was unusually thoughtful by Family Guy's standards, that it gave Lois Griffin a central role that the show rarely gave her, and that it managed to engage with one of the most fought-over political subjects in American life without collapsing into the kind of cheap joke resolution that most Family Guy episodes defaulted to when they brushed up against difficult material. The The episode was not perfect. It had moments that sat uneasily, as most Family Guy episodes do in one way or another, but it was a genuine attempt to say something genuine, and the people who saw it mostly recognized that. The DVD release came on September 28, 2010, and that was how American critics got access to it. A reviewer at IGN gave it a 7 out of 10 and noted that it was difficult to believe the writers had ever expected the episode to make it to air, given how directly and uncomplicatedly it engaged with a subject that American network television had treated as essentially untouchable. She specifically praised the fact that the show followed through on its ending, rather than finding a way to escape what it had set up. The cop-out ending, the resolution that lets a show touch a difficult subject without actually committing to a position on it, is so common in American television that its absence was worth noting. A writer for the website Salon offered a response that framed the situation in terms that went beyond the episode itself. She described Family Guy in terms that were not particularly flattering. A doofy show, generally built on sophomoric humor, and then made the observation that this doofy show had somehow become one of the only American television programs willing to address abortion directly, and that the fact that even this show had been prevented from doing so on American television said something important about where American broadcasting actually stood on the subject. She named specific shows, Glee, The Office, House, none of which had ever addressed abortion in the direct way that Partial Terms of Endearment did. The show that tried got banned. The shows that never tried continued airing without anyone suggesting they should be pulled. MacFarlane drew a specific comparison when he talked about the situation in interviews. He pointed to earlier Family Guy episodes about gay marriage and about an oil spill, both subjects that had initially been treated as too sensitive for primetime television and had gradually become acceptable to address as the cultural conversation around them shifted. He believed abortion would follow the same arc. He believed the episode would eventually feel less dangerous to American broadcasters as time passed and the cultural temperature changed. He expressed confidence that what felt too volatile in 2010 would eventually feel manageable. As of today, the episode has never aired in the United States. The cultural temperature around abortion in America has not moved in the direction MacFarlane anticipated. The episode remains on that DVD shelf. No American broadcaster has decided it is time. What makes this situation different from almost every other Family Guy controversy is a distinction that matters and is easy to miss. This is not an episode that failed. The critics who saw it did not say it was badly made or that it handled its subject irresponsibly. This is not an episode where the execution was the problem. MacFarlane himself described it as some of his writers' best and most meaningful work. The episode was banned not because it did something wrong with its subject, but because its subject was considered too dangerous to put on American television, regardless of how carefully or skillfully it was handled. Fox's concern was not about quality. It was about the subject existing at all, in prime time, on their network. That distinction changes what the story is about. Most Family Guy controversies are arguments about whether the show went too far with something, whether a joke was too cruel, a subject too raw, a target too vulnerable. This one is an argument about whether the show was allowed to go there at all. The answer every American broadcaster gave was no, not because of the joke, because of the subject. Lois Griffin spends most of Family Guy's run as a supporting character in her own household. She reacts to Peter, she manages the children, she holds things together. She is given storylines that resolve cleanly before they ask too much of her. Partial Terms of Endearment is the exception. The episode where she is placed at the center of an impossible situation and left there, where the show follows her through it without providing an easy exit, where she is treated as a full person making a real decision with real consequences, rather than as a plot device in someone else's story. That does not happen often in Family Guy. It barely happens in American television generally, and in the United States, that episode does not exist for most viewers. It lives on a disc in a box that most people have never purchased, about a subject that most American networks have still never addressed with the directness that a British channel put in its regular late-night slot on a Tuesday evening in June 2010 and treated as an ordinary broadcast decision. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The banned episodes are the clearest examples of where Family Guy ran directly into the wall of what American broadcasting would allow. But some of the show's most disturbing moments were not banned at all. They aired on schedule, they were reviewed and approved, they went out to millions of homes, and then the real world caught up with them in ways that nobody inside the show had planned for. Section 4, quote 6 __. The episode that looked like a prediction. Most of the time, when a television show gets in trouble, it is because of something it did on purpose. A joke that was too cruel. A scene that went further than it needed to go. A decision someone made in a writing room to push past a line that reasonable people agreed existed. The show knew what it was doing, and it did it anyway, and then it had to deal with the response. That is the normal shape of a Family Guy controversy. Someone chose to make something uncomfortable, the uncomfortable thing aired, and people reacted. The story of Turban Cowboy does not have that shape. What happened with this episode is stranger and more unsettling than a deliberate provocation. It is the story of a show that made a joke, aired the joke, and then watched the world outside its studio catch up to the joke in the worst possible way. Not because anyone planned it, not because anyone intended it, but because timing can be its own kind of horror. The episode is season 11, episode 15. It aired on Fox on March 17th, 2013. The main plot follows Peter Griffin befriending a Muslim man named Mahmoud, who he meets at a hospital. Peter, being Peter, does not understand what is happening around him as it is happening. He joins what he believes is a friendly social group, absorbs the warmth of being welcomed somewhere, and slowly realizes, far too slowly, in exactly the way Peter always realizes things, that Mahmoud is a terrorist who has been using Peter's obliviousness to his advantage. Mahmoud's method is specific. He gets Peter to use his cell phone at particular moments, and each time Peter does, bombs are detonated somewhere in Quahog. Peter has been unknowingly participating in attacks without knowing it, because Peter does not know anything until the show decides it is time for him to know. The plot is the kind of story Family Guy had told in various forms before. Peter stumbles into something dangerous through sheer inattention, chaos unfolds around him, and the show uses his particular kind of blindness as the lens through which it examines something real happening in the world. The episode was built around a real tension in American life in 2013. The ongoing anxiety about terrorism, about who was a threat and who was not, about how ordinary seeming situations could conceal danger. Family Guy approached that tension the way it approached most real tensions, by making Peter the fool who wanders into the middle of it, without ever fully grasping what he is inside of. Separate from the main plot, in a cutaway gag that runs for only a few seconds, Peter wins the Boston Marathon. He does not win it by running. He wins it by driving his car through the crowd of runners at speed, plowing through the people on the course, and arriving at the finish line ahead of everyone else because he was behind the wheel of a vehicle and they were on foot. The gag is quick, dark, and structurally identical to dozens of other Family Guy cutaway gags built on cartoon violence. The kind of thing the show had done hundreds of times across its run, without anyone treating it as anything other than the show being the show. Someone in the writing room thought it was funny in the particular way that absurdist cartoon violence is funny, when it is brief and unexpected and immediately over. It passed through the production process. It passed through Fox's review. It aired as part of the episode on March 17th, 2013, and the show moved on. 29 days later, on April 15th, 2013, 2 bombs exploded near the finish line of the real Boston Marathon. 3 people were killed. More than 260 people were injured, many of them severely. It was one of the most devastating attacks on American soil in years, and it happened at one of the most public and genuinely beloved events in the country. The Boston Marathon is not just a sporting event. It is a civic celebration, something the city of Boston builds its April around, something that draws runners who have trained for years, and spectators who line the streets for hours, and families who come to watch someone they love cross a finish line. The people who were near that finish line on April 15th, 2013, were not there because of any connection to politics or power or anything that might make them a target in any logical framework. They were there because they were watching a race. Fox pulled Turban Cowboy from Fox.com and Hulu almost immediately after the bombing. The decision was made quickly and implemented without fanfare. There was no press conference, no extended public statement laying out the reasoning in detail, just the episode quietly disappearing from the digital places where people could access it. The network stated that it had no immediate plans to broadcast the episode again. The removal was treated as self-evident, as something that did not require elaborate justification. A Family Guy episode containing a joke about driving through a crowd of runners at the Boston Marathon was not going to be available to stream in the days and weeks after real people were killed and injured near the finish line of the real Boston Marathon. That was the decision. It was back on the air by 2014, after enough time had passed that the immediate weight of the tragedy had shifted. But for the better part of a year, it was simply gone. What happened in between the bombing and the episode's return made everything significantly worse than it would otherwise have been. Someone took clips from Turban Cowboy and edited them together with real news footage from the Boston Marathon bombing. The clips from the episode were selected and arranged in a way that was designed to make it look like Family Guy had depicted the attack before it happened, as though the show had somehow known what was coming, had animated it in advance, and aired it a month before the real event. The edited video was not a subtle production. It was constructed specifically to deceive, to create the impression that the bombing had been predicted or reflected in a cartoon episode that preceded it. The video was uploaded to YouTube. It spread with the speed that fabricated content spreads when it is emotionally charged and when the platform distributing it has not yet developed the instinct to question what it is passing along. Millions of people watched it. It circulated across social media platforms at a time when the practice of checking whether a video was real before sharing it was far less common than it has since become. People who had never seen the original Turban Cowboy episode, who had no frame of reference for what Family Guy had actually aired, or how its cutaway gags worked, or what the context of the marathon joke was, watched the edited video and came away believing they had seen something genuinely disturbing, evidence that a television show had depicted a real terrorist attack before it happened. Seth MacFarlane responded publicly and with clear anger. He called the video shameful. He stated directly that the people who had made it and spread it were using a tragedy in which real people had died and been injured as material for internet content, and that what the video showed was not what the show had done. The edited footage had taken two separate things, the cutaway gag about the marathon and the real news footage from the bombing, and cut them together in a sequence that implied a connection which did not exist. The Family Guy team had not predicted anything. They had not depicted the bombing. They had made a dark joke about a marathon, and then a real attack had happened at a marathon. And someone had exploited that coincidence in the worst possible way. YouTube removed the video eventually. By the time it came down, it had been seen by an enormous number of people. The damage it caused to how the episode was understood and remembered was not undone by the removal. People who encountered the story through the fabricated video, rather than through accurate coverage, carried away a version of events that was false. That Family Guy had somehow depicted the Boston Marathon bombing before it happened. That the connection between the show and the real attack was not accidental, but something stranger and more troubling. That false version of the story has continued to circulate in parts of the internet years after the video was debunked and removed. It is, at this point, more persistent than the accurate version for a significant portion of the people who have heard of the episode at all. The episode itself, completely separate from the fabricated video, had real problems of its own that existed before April 15th and would have existed regardless of what happened that day. The main plot of Turban Cowboy chose to make a Muslim character the primary villain, a terrorist who deceives and manipulates an innocent person into participating in attacks. That choice was made in a specific cultural context. By 2013, American public life had been shaped for over a decade by anxiety about terrorism and by the particular ways that anxiety had attached itself to Muslim identity in American public imagination. The association between Islam and terrorism in American media and in American public discourse had caused real harm to real Muslim Americans, people who were not terrorists, who had nothing to do with violence, who experienced the consequences of that association in their daily lives, regardless of anything they had done or not done. Family Guy was not the first piece of American entertainment to use a Muslim character as a terrorist villain, and it was far from the most prominent example of that choice in American popular culture. The show could point to a long history of using characters from every background as villains, as fools, as targets of jokes. That history was real, but the specific combination of a Muslim terrorist as the main antagonist of the plot and a cutaway joke about driving through a crowd at a marathon in an episode that aired 29 days before real bombs killed real people at the real Boston Marathon created something that no amount of pointing to context or history or the show's general approach to dark material could fully address. The question the episode's removal raised, what is the right thing to do when entertainment accidentally connects to real tragedy, does not have a clean answer. Family Guy did not cause the bombing. Nobody who thought carefully about it argued that it did. The show had no knowledge of what was coming. The connection between Turban Cowboy and April 15th, 2013 was a coincidence, a collision of bad timing with no intent or foreknowledge behind it. And yet, Fox pulled the episode, and Fox was right to pull it, and the show did not argue against the decision. The network that had never pulled the AIDS joke, that had fought in court for the right to air the Weinstein parody song, that had allowed the Schiavo musical and the Holocaust episode and hundreds of other dark moments to air without intervention. That network looked at Turban Cowboy in the days after the bombing and made a quiet, immediate decision that the episode should not be available. That decision was itself a kind of answer to the question. Not a permanent answer, not a verdict that the episode was wrong to have been made or that the show had done something unforgivable. Just an acknowledgement that context changes what things mean. A joke about driving through a crowd at a marathon means one thing on March 17th, 2013. It means something different on April 16th, 2013. The day after 3 people died near a marathon finish line. The distance between the cartoon and reality that Family Guy had always relied on. The gap that made dark jokes acceptable because they were clearly clearly not real, had collapsed. Not because of anything the show did, because of a date on a calendar and what happened on that date. The episode came back. By 2014, it was available again. People could watch it and understand what it was: a dark Family Guy episode with a poorly timed cutaway gag and a plot about terrorism that had more problems than just timing. The fabricated video continued to circulate. The accurate version of events continued to be less interesting than the false one to the people encountering the story for the first time in the years that followed. Turban Cowboy ended up in the particular category of Family Guy moments that cannot be discussed without the real world walking into the room uninvited. The show did not put the real world there. The real world arrived on its own 29 days after the episode aired, and it has not fully left since. __quote _7 __. Not every Family Guy controversy arrives that way. Some of them are the result of very deliberate choices to look directly at something painful and real and build an entire episode around it. And some of those choices go wrong, not because of bad timing and not because of a fake video, but simply because the show misjudged what it was capable of handling. The next episode on this list is the clearest example of that. It is an episode that tried to say something serious about a serious subject and ended up being remembered as one of the most troubling things the show ever put on screen. Section 5, __quote _8 where dark comedy stopped being comedy. Family Guy has a specific kind of confidence about dark material. It comes from years of practice, from having gone into uncomfortable territory so many times that the writers developed a working theory about how to do it. The theory goes something like this: if you make the joke absurd enough, if you push it far enough past the point of reality that it becomes clearly a cartoon version of a real thing, rather than the real thing itself, the audience can laugh without feeling like they have done something wrong. The distance between the joke and the truth is what makes the laughter possible. It is the gap between what is being depicted and what the audience knows about the world that gives them permission to find it funny rather than upsetting. Family Guy had tested that theory across hundreds of episodes and dozens of subjects, and it had worked often enough that the writing room trusted it deeply. Screams of Silence. The story of Brenda Q is the episode where that theory stopped working entirely. Not because the subject matter was darker than anything the show had attempted before. Family Guy had gone into darker places on other occasions. Not because the execution was more graphic than usual. The show had been graphic before without the same response. It stopped working because the show tried to do something it had never actually done before, and did not have the skills or the framework to do correctly. It tried to play a serious story completely straight, without the protective layer of absurdist distance that normally made difficult material bearable, and the result was something that satisfied neither the requirements of dark comedy nor the requirements of genuine drama. The episode is Season 10, Episode 3. It aired on Fox on October 9th, 2011, exactly 1 week after Seahorse Seashell Party, the episode that came directly before it in the season. The placement of these two episodes back to back is significant and worth keeping in mind as the story of this one unfolds. The subject of Screams of Silence is domestic abuse. Not domestic abuse used as a quick punchline inside a longer joke. Not a passing reference to abuse treated as a background detail. An entire episode with its own dedicated storyline, trying to look directly at what domestic abuse is and what it does to the person living inside it. Quagmire's sister Brenda is in a relationship with a man named Jeff. Jeff is abusive. He hits Brenda physically. He controls her emotionally. He frightens her in ways that go beyond specific incidents of violence into a continuous atmosphere of threat that shapes how she moves through the world and how she thinks about her own options. Jeff does not attempt to hide what he is doing. He is abusive in front of Quagmire, in front of Joe, in front of Peter, in front of the very people who are positioned in the episode as the ones who care about Brenda and want to help her. The abuse is not a secret. It is simply a fact of Brenda's life that everyone around her can see and that she cannot or will not acknowledge as something she needs to leave. Brenda is played by Caitlin Olsen. By 2011, Olsen was well known to television audiences primarily through It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia, where she played Dee Reynolds, a character who occupied a very different kind of dark comedy space, someone whose dysfunction was played entirely for laughs within a show built entirely around dysfunction being funny. Her casting in Screams of Silence was widely noted by critics as one of the episode's better decisions. Olsen had real emotional range, more than most guest performers Family Guy had worked with, and the role as written required someone capable of conveying genuine fear and entrapment in a way that the
the audience would believe rather than dismiss. The episode is largely played straight. That sentence is the most important one in understanding what went wrong with it. And it is the thing that separates Screams of Silence from almost every other Family Guy episode that has ever touched a difficult subject. There is no real comedic frame around the abuse as it is depicted. Jeff does not hit Brenda in the exaggerated, cartoonish way that signals to the audience that what they are watching is a parody of violence rather than a depiction of it. The show does not use timing or music or the reactions of other characters to signal that this is safe to laugh at. The scenes between Brenda and Jeff are presented as real and painful and frightening in the specific way that real domestic abuse is real and painful and frightening. They are not cutaway gags. They are not quick moments that the episode moves past before the audience has time to process them. They are the episode. The show parks itself inside what Brenda's daily life looks like and stays there
without offering the audience any of the comedic release that normally makes dark Family Guy content manageable. Quagmire, Joe, and Peter witness what is happening to Brenda directly. They are not receiving secondhand information about the abuse or inferring it from context. They see Jeff's behavior with their own eyes, in real time, in their presence. The episode gives them conversations about it. They argue with each other about what they should do. They struggle with the fact that Brenda keeps defending Jeff and making excuses for him and insisting that she does not want to leave. They experience the specific helplessness that people on the outside of an abusive relationship often experience, when they can see clearly what the person they love cannot yet see about their own situation. The episode is clearly trying to engage honestly with that helplessness. It is trying to say something true about how abuse works, about why it is so hard to leave, about why people who love someone being abused feel so stuck. The conclusion the episode arrives at is that Quagmire, Joe, and Peter murder Jeff and stage the scene to make it look like a suicide, so that Brenda can be free of him. The critical response to this ending was immediate, detailed, and almost unanimously negative. The central problem that every critic identified was the same problem, articulated in different ways. The show that had spent years using domestic abuse as a casual source of comedy, using the way the Griffin family treated Meg as a running joke, using violence against female characters as a reliable punchline across season after season, had produced an episode that presented itself as a serious reckoning with abuse, and had resolved that reckoning by having the men in Brenda's life make all of the decisions on her behalf, including the decision to commit murder, without Brenda having any role in or knowledge of what was happening. Brenda does not choose to leave. Brenda does not take any step toward her own freedom. She is simply relocated from one situation to another by three men who decided they knew what was best for her and acted on that decision without consulting her. The show treats this as the happy ending. Jeff is dead. Brenda is free. The episode does not pause to examine whether murder was the right answer, whether the men who committed it made an appropriate choice, whether Brenda deserved to have her situation resolved without her participation or her knowledge. It simply presents the outcome as a resolution and moves on. One piece of media criticism that circulated widely in the period after the episode aired documented something specific and striking about the show's track record in the season surrounding Screams of Silence. The critic counted how many consecutive Family Guy episodes could be watched in order before reaching one that did not contain some form of violence against a female character. The answer was 14. 14 episodes in a row before Screams of Silence featured Meg, Lois, or another female character being physically struck, knocked down, murdered, or harmed in some way. The abuse of female characters was so constant in the show's output during this period that it had become effectively invisible, a background condition of the show rather than a specific choice being made in specific episodes. Screams of Silence was the 15th episode in that stretch. It was the episode where the show decided to stand up and make a statement about how terrible domestic abuse was. The irony was complete enough that critics did not have to work hard to make the point. The show that could not produce 14 consecutive episodes without harming a female character was now producing an episode about how harmful it is to harm women. The show that had trained its audience to laugh at Meg being hurt was now asking that same audience to feel the weight of Brenda being hurt. The show that had built an entire recurring dynamic around a woman absorbing mistreatment for the benefit of the people around her was now framing another woman's abuse as something requiring serious attention and a serious response. The episode failed on both of the levels it was trying to operate on simultaneously. As dark comedy, it did not work. The show had committed too hard to the serious framing for the audience to find the release that comedy requires. There was nothing to laugh at, no signal that laughter was appropriate. appropriate. No absurdist distance between the material and the reality it was depicting. As serious drama, it also did not work. The resolution through secret murder, the complete removal of the abused woman's agency from the outcome of her own situation, the absence of any examination of whether what Quagmire, Joe, and Peter did was right or wrong. None of that constituted a serious dramatic treatment of anything. The episode sat in the space between comedy and drama and reached neither shore. Critics who reviewed it at the time reached for specific language to describe what had gone wrong. The AV Club ranked it among the worst episodes the show had produced at any point in its run. The words that appeared most consistently across negative reviews were morally confused, mean-spirited without purpose, and shockingly violent. Watch Mojo would later place the episode on multiple ranked lists of the most controversial and most widely criticized Family Guy episodes. What was notable about the consistency of the negative response was that it was not primarily about the darkness of the subject or the graphic nature of some of the scenes. It was about the confusion, the sense that a show that normally knew exactly what it was doing had produced something that did not seem to know what it was trying to be or why.
Caitlin Olsen's performance became the one thing almost every critic agreed was genuinely good. Reviewers who had nothing positive to say about the writing, the structure, or the resolution consistently praised what Olsen brought to Brenda as a character. Her portrayal of someone trapped and frightened and unable to see a way out was described as affecting and specific and real in a way that the episode around it was not. The praise for Olsen's work made the failure of the surrounding material more frustrating to critics rather than less, because it suggested that with a different script, a different conclusion, and a different understanding of what the episode was supposed to be doing, the raw material of a meaningful piece of television had been present. Olsen did her job. The episode did not do its. Domestic abuse advocacy organizations and critics who specifically studied how media depicted abuse focused their responses on the ending with particular intensity. The resolution of the episode, three men deciding together that the solution to a woman's abuse is to murder the abuser without the woman's knowledge or participation, is not a neutral storytelling choice. It reflects and reinforces a specific and harmful set of ideas about how abuse works and what survivors of abuse need. Organizations working with abuse survivors had spent years and enormous resources trying to shift public understanding away from the framework that abuse victims are passive people waiting to be rescued, toward the understanding that leaving an abusive situation is a complex and personal process that requires the survivor's own agency, their own decisions, their own timing. The Screams of Silence ending moved directly against that understanding. It presented rescue by proxy, accomplished through violence and without the survivor's knowledge, as the appropriate and satisfying resolution. The episode aired 1 week after Seahorse Seashell Party. That timing, taken alongside the content of both episodes, created something that critics found impossible to look away from. Seahorse Seashell Party had concluded that an abuse victim should stay in her abusive situation for the benefit of the people abusing her. Screams of Silence concluded that an abuse victim should be freed from her abusive situation by the men in her life making that decision on her behalf. Back to back, in the same season, on the same show. Both episodes about women experiencing mistreatment. Both episodes arriving at conclusions that removed the woman from any meaningful role in determining what happened to her. The show did not appear to recognize that it was telling the same story twice in consecutive weeks from slightly different angles, arriving at the same fundamental position both times. Screams of Silence has not been reassessed in the way some Family Guy controversies eventually are. Some episodes that generated outrage when they first aired are now discussed as misunderstood or ahead of their time or brave in ways the audience was not ready to appreciate. This episode has not been rehabilitated. It appears consistently on lists of the show's worst hours, compiled years after it aired, by fans and critics who are not simply reacting to its initial reception, but arriving at the same conclusion independently. The reason it stays on those lists is not that it was shocking, it is that it was confused in a way that revealed something true and uncomfortable about the limits of what Family Guy understood about its own material. The show that produced Screams of Silence was a show that had developed enormous confidence in its ability to handle anything. That confidence had been earned in part through genuine success, through episodes that went into dark places and found something real there. But confidence built from success in one area does not automatically transfer to a different area. And the area Screams of Silence tried to enter, honest, direct, dramatically coherent storytelling about real human suffering, was one the show had never actually operated in before. The tools it had
developed for dark comedy, for absurdist violence, for pushing past the line of what audiences found comfortable, were not the right tools for the job it was trying to do. __quote_9___. The episode that came directly before it in the season, and which aired just 1 week earlier, had its own deeply troubling problem. A problem that was almost the exact opposite. Not a show trying to be serious and failing, but a show trying to address something true about itself, and then choosing, deliberately, to undo everything it had just said. Section 6, Quote 10. The episode that told abuse victims to stay there is a scene in Season 10 of Family Guy that fans had been waiting for since roughly Season 3. It arrives in an episode called Seahorse Seashell Party, and when it finally happens, it is genuinely satisfying in a way that very little Family Guy had been for a long time. Meg Griffin, after years of being the family's target, after years of absorbing every insult and every dismissal and every moment of casual cruelty that the Griffins threw in her direction, without anyone ever stopping to ask whether it was fair, finally snaps. She looks at her family and she tells them exactly what they are. She goes through them one by one. She is right about all of it. The scene lands. And then the episode takes it all back. Seahorse Seashell Party is Season 10, Episode 2. It aired on October 2nd, 2011, as part of a crossover event that Fox called Night of the Hurricane, which ran across Family Guy, The Cleveland Show, and American Dad simultaneously. All 3 shows were set during the same hurricane hitting the same region, with each show following its own family through the same night. The crossover was a significant production effort, and Fox promoted it as a major event. Seahorse Seashell Party was Family Guy's contribution to that night. The episode has 2 separate stories running alongside each other. In one, Brian secretly eats magic mushrooms and spends the episode having increasingly disturbing hallucinations, including a sequence where he cuts off his own ear while the show animates the scene in full detail. Critics who reviewed the episode noted the hallucination sequence as genuinely unsettling in a way that felt more mean-spirited than funny. A long, strange, visually unpleasant stretch of animation that existed primarily to be gross rather than to say anything or build toward anything. The main story is Meg's. To understand why the Meg confrontation scene landed the way it did, you have to understand what Family Guy had done with Meg Griffin across roughly 9 seasons of television. Meg is the oldest Griffin child. She is a teenager trying to exist in a world that has decided, for no particular reason, that she is the least important person in every room she enters. Her family mocks her constantly, Peter forgets she exists, Lois treats her concerns as lesser than everyone else's, Chris goes along with whatever the family's current attitude toward Meg is, Stewie, who is a baby, has more standing in the Griffin household than Meg does. The show built this dynamic early and leaned on it harder and harder as the seasons went on, to the point where entire episodes were built around the premise that everyone, including the audience, was supposed to find Meg's pain funny. The running joke about Meg was never really a joke with a punchline. It was a condition. She existed to be dismissed. "Shut up, Meg," said by Peter, said by Lois, said by whoever happened to be in the scene, became one of the most recognizable phrases associated with the show. The dismissal was the joke. The fact that there was a real person behind the dismissal, someone who was suffering real harm from the people who were supposed to love her, was something the show treated as irrelevant. By season 10, enough fans had pointed out that the Meg dynamic had stopped being funny and started being genuinely uncomfortable that the show appeared to feel some pressure to address it. Seahorse Seashell Party was the response. Meg, trapped in the house during the hurricane, pushed past her limit by one more round of family cruelty, finally turns around and says everything. She tells Peter that he is a terrible father whose only contribution to her life has been making her feel worthless. She tells Lois that she is not the good mother she pretends to be, that she enables Peter's behavior and uses Meg as a target to redirect her own frustrations. She goes after Chris for going along with it. The speech is specific and earned and lands with real emotional weight because the show had spent 9 seasons providing evidence for everything Meg says in that moment. She is not wrong about any of it. The audience that had watched those 9 seasons knew she was not wrong. The scene works because it is true. After Meg's speech, the family falls apart. Without a shared target for their frustration, the Griffins turn on each other. Peter and Lois fight. Chris and Peter fight. The absence of Meg as the designated punching bag reveals exactly what the punching bag was doing for them. It was holding the family's chaos together by giving everyone a direction to point their worst impulses. Without Meg absorbing everything, they have nothing to absorb it for them. Then Meg apologizes. She sits the family down and explains that she has thought about it, and she understands that she needs to keep being what she has been. been. She is the family's lightning rod. She is the person who absorbs all the pain so that the rest of them can function. Without her in that role, they will fall apart. She accepts this. She chooses to return to it. The episode presents this as Meg demonstrating a kind of maturity and selflessness that the rest of the family is not capable of. She understands the system, she understands her place in it, and she sacrifices her own well-being to keep the people she loves functional. The AV Club gave the episode a grade of D+. The critic Kevin McFarland wrote that what the episode did with Meg was too little, too late. That the show had spent years building a dynamic it now expected one episode to justify, and the justification it offered was not adequate. He made a comparison that stuck. Nobody cares about the Griffins the way audiences care about The Simpsons, and the reason is that The Simpsons built genuine affection between its characters and its audience over time, while Family Guy had gone in the opposite direction, with Meg joining the audience in mocking her rather than giving the audience a reason to root for her. He concluded that one forced episode of pointed self-examination did not change anything. Taryn Moore of Ology gave the episode a 4.5 out of 10 and described it as spending a lot of time addressing something that did not need to be addressed, which is a specific kind of criticism that cuts at the premise itself. The show did not need to justify the Meg dynamic with an episode. It needed to simply stop doing it. The episode was not a solution to the problem. It was an acknowledgement that the problem existed, followed by a decision to continue doing the problem with a new philosophical framework around it. The domestic abuse advocacy concern with the episode is precise and serious. The conclusion Meg reaches, that victims of mistreatment should stay in abusive situations for the benefit of their abusers because the abusers cannot function without someone to take their pain out on, is not a quirky animated television ending. It is the reasoning that keeps real people trapped in real harmful situations. The specific thought pattern that Meg goes through at the end of the episode, the logic she uses to talk herself back into the role of target, is a version of the same reasoning that people who work with abuse survivors spend enormous effort trying to help people recognize and push back against. Abusers often cannot function without their victims. That is true. It is also not a reason for the victim to stay. The show did not frame it as Meg making a tragic mistake. It framed it as Meg making a wise and mature choice. Lois, who had been crying and falling apart after Meg's initial speech, benefits from Meg's return to the old dynamic. The episode ends with the family restored to its baseline, which is to say, with Meg back in the position of absorbing everyone else's worst behavior so that the household can function. The camera does not linger on what this costs Meg. The episode does not ask the audience to feel troubled by it. It presents equilibrium as a happy ending. TV Fanatics reviewer noted that even though Meg confronting her family was long overdue, the episode felt contrived, and the ending undercut whatever genuine feeling the confrontation had built. The word contrived is important there. It suggests that the episode was not actually interested in Meg. It was interested in the appearance of being interested in Meg, in the gesture of acknowledging the problem, without any commitment to actually changing anything, which is exactly what happened. The show continued to use Meg as a target after Seahorse Seashell Party. The episode that was supposed to address the dynamic addressed it for 22 minutes and then put the dynamic back exactly where it had found it. What makes the episode's placement in the season so significant is what came directly after it. 1 week later, Screams of Silence aired, the episode about Quagmire's sister in an abusive relationship, where the show tried to take domestic abuse seriously and failed in a different way. 2 consecutive episodes, back-to-back in the same season, dealing with abuse and mistreatment of women. One that told a victim her role was to absorb the abuse for everyone else's benefit, one that resolved abuse through secret murder while removing any agency from the person being abused. Neither one got it right. Neither one treated its subject with the understanding or care it required. And the fact that they aired in sequence, one after the other, in the same season, on the same show, made the pattern impossible to ignore. The show was circling something it could not quite face directly. It knew enough to know the Meg dynamic was a problem. It knew enough to know domestic abuse was serious. It did not know enough, or did not care enough, or both, to handle either of those things in a way that reflected any real understanding of what it was depicting. The 2 episodes together are the clearest evidence of a show that had developed a sense of its own limits, but had not developed the ability to work honestly within them. Most of what Family Guy had done wrong up to this point was a matter of going too far, being too dark, being too callous, making too light of things that deserved more weight. What Seahorse Seashell Party and Screams of Silence revealed was a different failure, not not going too far, but not going far enough, not being willing to follow the truth of what they were saying all the way to where it actually led.
Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously.
Some of Family Guy's most difficult moments came from real people and real tragedies that the show turned into material. And among those, there is one that stands out for a specific reason. It involved a real family, a real death, a real court case that the entire country had watched unfold, and a musical number performed by children that made that family reach out to a television network and beg them to cancel the show. Section 7, quote 12 and Terri Schiavo, the musical. When a real family protested. There is a specific kind of cruelty that comes from turning a real person's suffering into entertainment. Not a fictional character, not a public figure who chose to enter the arena of public life, not a politician or a celebrity who accepted that their choices would be scrutinized and sometimes mocked.
A real person, a private person, someone who never asked to be famous, whose life became a national news story not because of anything she did, but because of what happened to her body and what the people who loved her could not agree on afterward. Terri Schiavo did not choose to become a symbol. She did not choose to become a debate. She did not choose to become a musical performed by preschoolers on a Fox animated sitcom. None of those things were choices she made. They happened to her, the way everything in the last 15 years of her life happened to her, without her having any say in any of it. To understand why the Family Guy joke about Terri Schiavo landed differently from most of what the show had done before, you need to understand who Terri Schiavo was and what her story meant to the people who had lived through it alongside her, not as spectators of a news event, but as the family at the center of one of the most painful and public legal battles in American history. Teresa Marie Schiavo was 26 years old in February 1990 when she collapsed in her home in Florida. Her heart stopped. She was without oxygen for long enough to cause severe and irreversible brain damage. She was resuscitated, her heart was restarted, her body was kept alive, but by the time doctors fully assessed what had happened to her, they concluded she was in what they described as a persistent vegetative state. The part of her brain that had made her who she was, that held her memories, her personality, her ability to recognize the people around her, her ability to communicate in any form, was gone. She could not speak. She could not respond. She needed tubes and machines to survive. The Terri Schiavo who had been a living, laughing, active person in the world effectively ceased to exist in February 1990. What remained was her body, kept functioning by medical equipment, and the people who loved her trying to figure out what to do. For 8 years, her husband Michael Schiavo and her parents Robert and Mary Schindler tried to navigate that question together. Then, in 1998, Michael Schiavo went to court. He petitioned a judge to have Terri's feeding tube removed, arguing that Terri had expressed in her lifetime that she would not want to be kept alive in a condition like this, that keeping her body functioning was not what she would have chosen for herself, and that allowing her to die was the most respectful thing that could be done for her. Her parents fought back with everything they had. They believed Terri was still present in some meaningful way, still aware of the people around her, still capable of some form of recovery if given more time and different care. They believed removing the feeding tube was not mercy, it was murder. What followed was a legal battle that lasted 7 years and grew far beyond the bounds of a family dispute in Florida. It moved through court after court. It reached the Florida state legislature, which passed a specific law called Terri's Law, attempting to intervene in the case, and that law was later struck down by the Florida Supreme Court. It reached the United States Congress, which passed its own emergency legislation ordering a federal court to review the case. President George W. Bush flew back to Washington from vacation specifically to sign that legislation into law. The case became one of the most talked about and most fought over public debates in American life during that period. A collision of questions about medical ethics, religious belief, marriage, parental rights, disability, and the definition of life that people felt so strongly about that they stationed themselves outside Terri's hospice with signs and cameras and prayers. When the feeding tube was finally removed in March 2005 and Terri Schiavo died 13 days later, she had been at the center of that public battle for the better part of a decade. Her family had lived every moment of it in front of cameras and reporters and protesters and politicians. Bobby Schindler, her brother, had spoken publicly in support of keeping his sister alive. Her parents had given press conferences and granted interviews and watched strangers argue passionately about their daughter's fate on television news programs every night for years. When Terri died, the family did not simply grieve in private. They continued to speak about what had happened, about what they believed it meant, about the sister and daughter they had lost not once, but in two very different ways, first in 1990 and then again in 2005. The Family Guy episode that made her into a musical is called Peter Assment. It is season 8, episode 16, and it aired in 2010.
2010, 5 years after Terri Schiavo's death. The main plot of the episode involves Peter being sexually harassed by his boss Angela at the Quahog Brewery, a storyline that generated its own set of criticisms separate from what this section is about. Inside the episode, the Griffin family attends one of Stewie's preschool performances. Preschool performances are a very specific kind of event. Small children in costume, delivering lines and songs with the concentrated effort of people who have been practicing for weeks. Parents in folding chairs, watching with the particular pride and amusement that comes from watching very young children try very hard at something. The format carries a warmth and an innocence that is almost entirely self-contained. It is one of the most reliably wholesome settings in human experience. The preschool class performs a musical about the Terri Schiavo case. The children take on the roles of the real people involved in the real legal battle that had played out on national television for 7 years. They sing songs. The lyrics include the line, "Terri Schiavo is kind of a live-o." They describe her feeding machine as something that dispenses gravy for her mashed potato brains. They call her the most expensive plant you will ever see. The children deliver these lines with the brightness and enthusiasm of children who have memorized their parts and are doing their best to perform well, completely unaware of what the words they are singing mean, of who the person they are singing about was, of what her family experienced, of what any of it refers to. The gap between the innocence of the performers and the darkness of the content is precisely where the show is looking for the comedy. The children do not know. The adults in the Griffin family watching them do. That gap is the joke. Bobby Schindler Jr. found out about the episode. Terri's brother, who had spent years fighting publicly for his sister's life and who was still alive in 2010, still carrying what his family had been through, responded publicly and directly. He contacted Fox and told them to cancel Family Guy entirely, not to apologize, not to pull the specific episode, to cancel the whole show. His sister had died 5 years earlier, after one of the most painful and public experiences any private family has ever been subjected to in American life. His family had fought for her in courtrooms and in the media and in the public square, had watched politicians make speeches about her, had watched strangers argue about what she deserved while standing outside her hospice. And 5 years after her death, a cartoon had put her name in the mouths of preschool children and given those children songs that described her brain as mashed potatoes and called her a plant. The American Life League, a pro-life organization that had been actively involved in the public fight around the Schiavo case during the years it was in the courts, also launched a formal protest against the episode. The organization's argument was specific and grounded. Terri Schiavo could not speak for herself. Her condition had left her entirely dependent on other people to treat her with whatever dignity they chose to extend to her. She had no ability to object to being mocked, no ability to respond to what was being said about her, no platform from which to push back. Using someone in that position as material for comedy and doing it through the specific device of having children sing cheerful songs about her brain damage was not a form of satire that served any purpose. It was cruelty aimed at someone who had no defenses left. Disability rights advocates joined the response from a different angle, one that extended beyond Terri Schiavo specifically. Their concern was about what the language of the song communicated more broadly about how people with severe brain injuries and significant disabilities were seen and valued. The specific phrases the show had written and given to the children to sing, mashed potato brains, the most expensive plant, reduced a human being entirely to her medical condition, to her cost, to her physical incapacity. Those were not neutral descriptive terms. They were the language of dehumanization, the same language that disability rights advocates had spent enormous effort pushing back against in medical settings, in legal frameworks, and in public culture. The argument that someone with a brain injury was not a real person, was just a vegetable, was just an expense that should be eliminated, that argument had real consequences in the real world for real people with real disabilities who were still alive and still navigating a society that did not always treat them as fully human. Family Guy had taken that argument, made it rhyme, and given it to a class of preschoolers to perform for their parents. Fox did not pull the episode. Seth MacFarlane did not issue a statement specifically about the Schiavo musical. The show did not respond to Bobby Schindler's call for cancellation. The American Life League's formal protest did not change anything. The episode aired, the response came, and the show continued on its schedule as though nothing unusual had happened. This was not an unusual response for Family Guy. The show had faced protests and formal complaints and demands for cancellation before, and the standard response had always been some version of the same thing. Continue, defend if pressed, and do not apologize. What makes the Schiavo musical different from many other Family Guy controversies is a combination of specific factors that that, taken together, made it harder to defend than most of what the show had done. The AIDS barbershop quartet had a defense, thin but real, that the joke was about the absurdity of the delivery rather than about AIDS itself. The JFK Pez dispenser was a quick sight gag about a historical event that had happened 36 years earlier. The Weinstein episode could point to a tradition of satire that mocked bigotry by depicting it. These defenses were available. Some people found them convincing, some did not. The Schiavo musical had a harder set of facts to defend against. This was not a passing reference to a historical tragedy. It was a full musical number with composed lyrics about a specific and named real woman who had died 5 years before the episode aired. Her family was not a historical abstraction. Her brother was alive and reachable and responded publicly. Her death had not become the kind of distant historical event that comedy had traditionally felt freer to address. 5 years is not a long time. The specific details of her condition, the feeding tube, the vegetative state, the dispute over whether she was present or gone, were the direct content of the song. The show had not taken a dark historical subject and used it to say something about the present. It had taken a recent, raw, still grieved death and made it the punchline. The choice to use preschoolers as the performers is the detail that most critics and commentators returned to when they thought about what made the scene so specifically uncomfortable. Children performing a musical about a woman in a vegetative state creates a kind of wrongness that an adult performance of the same material would not generate. Adults could be understood as choosing to engage with difficult material. Adults bring their own understanding and their own accountability to what they say. Children have none of that. They are performing what they have been told to perform, delivering words they have been given, with the complete trust that the words are appropriate because the adults around them have decided they are. The show used that quality deliberately. The brightness and the innocence of the children made the darkness of the content more extreme by contrast, and that contrast was the technique. It worked as a technique. Whether it was the right technique for this specific material, whether the darkness being intensified was darkness that needed intensifying, was the question that nobody at Fox or on the show appeared to have asked before it aired. Seth MacFarlane, by the time Peter Asment aired in 2010, had built a long and detailed public record of defending his show's right to go wherever it chose to go. He had defended the AIDS joke, he had fought for the Weinstein episode to be understood as satire rather than anti-Semitism. He had pushed hard for partial terms of endearment to be treated as serious television about a serious subject. He had a consistent and clearly held position that comedy had the right to address anything, that treating subjects as off-limits was a form of dishonesty, and that the short-term discomfort of a dark joke was worth the larger value of maintaining comedy's freedom to go anywhere. As far as the public record shows, he never said anything specifically about the Schiavo musical. The protests from Bobby Schindler, from the American Life League, from disability advocates, they did not generate a MacFarlane response. The show's position, communicated through its silence, was that the joke did not require a defense, that the protests, however sincere and however grounded in real pain, were not the kind of response that required the show to account for itself, that silence is itself a piece of information. MacFarlane has spoken publicly about many Family Guy moments that generated controversy. He went on record about the JFK Pez dispenser. He commented on the Weinstein episode. He discussed partial terms of endearment extensively. He chose not to discuss the Schiavo musical in any public forum. What that choice means, whether it reflects confidence that the joke was defensible and simply did not need defending, or whether it reflects something harder to name, is not something the public record can answer. What the public record does show is that a real family, dealing with a real loss, reached out to a television network and asked for something and received nothing in return. Bobby Schindler asked for the show to be canceled. Fox did not cancel it. He did not ask for an apology. He did not ask for the episode to be pulled. He asked for the show to be gone. That request came from a place of real pain about something specific and recent and personal. The network's response was the absence of a response. Some of the show's most examined controversies involve living people who could respond, people who were still in the world when the jokes were made and who had the ability to push back publicly. The Schiavo case was unusual because the person at the center of the joke could not respond, by definition, and the people responding on her behalf were doing so from a position of grief rather than from any kind of power or platform. The show was not punching up or punching sideways. It was putting the name and the medical condition of a dead private individual into a preschool song and waiting to see what happened. What happened was that her brother called called for the show to be canceled. Multiple organizations protested formally. Disability advocates made a serious and grounded argument about what the language of the song communicated, and the show continued unchanged. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Some of the show's most difficult moments came from comedic choices that made real people angry in ways that could not be contained by the usual defenses. The Schiavo episode was one of those. But there is another moment in Family Guy's history that is unique for a different reason. Not because of who it hurt, not because of what it depicted, but because the person who regretted it most publicly was the man who made the show in the first place. One scene from season 1, and the single time Seth MacFarlane looked back across everything Family Guy had ever done and said, out of all of it, that is the one I wish we had not made. Section 8. Road to Germany. Holocaust humor with a Jewish character along for the ride. There is a particular challenge that comes with making comedy about the Holocaust. Not because comedy cannot touch darkness. It has always been able to, and the history of Jewish comedy itself is full of examples of humor used as a way to process and survive historical pain. The challenge is about who is making the joke, what the joke is actually saying, and whether the people doing the laughing are laughing at the darkness or at the people who lived inside it. Those distinctions matter. They are not always easy to see in the moment, and they are not always easy to defend after the fact. Family Guy walked directly into all of those questions in season 7 with an episode called Road to Germany, and the conversation it started has never fully settled. The Road to episodes are among the most beloved in Family Guy's catalog. They are named after the old Hope and Crosby road trip movies from the 1940s and 1950s, a series of comedy films where two friends ended up in increasingly ridiculous situations in various exotic locations. Family Guy borrowed that structure and applied it to Brian and Stewie, who became the show's version of the wandering duo. Two characters with genuinely different personalities and a genuine dynamic that worked better than almost any other pairing the show attempted. The Road to episodes gave Brian and Stewie space to be something more than their usual roles allowed. Brian got to be genuinely clever and occasionally vulnerable. Stewie got to be both the villain and the straight man, depending on what the scene required. The episodes were usually inventive, often very funny, and consistently among the highest rated installments of any given season. Road to Germany is season 7, episode 3. It aired on October 5th, 2008. The premise is built on a time travel accident. Mort Goldman, the show's recurring Jewish character who runs a pharmacy in Quahog, accidentally activates one of Stewie's time machines. Mort is not a sophisticated character. He has been used across the show's run primarily as a source of jokes about Jewish anxiety, Jewish frugality, and Jewish neuroses. He is not portrayed with much depth or much dignity. He is a collection of stereotypes assembled into a character shape. Brian and Stewie go after Mort to bring him back, and they arrive at their destination, Warsaw, Poland, in September 1939. The Nazi invasion of Poland began on September 1st, 1939. What the episode drops its characters into is not an abstract historical setting. It is the specific moment when the systematic murder of millions of Jewish people was beginning. The German military was moving through Poland. Jewish families were about to lose everything: their homes, their businesses, their freedom, their lives. The Holocaust, which would eventually kill 6 million Jewish people along with millions of others, was starting. And Family Guy decided this was the backdrop for a Brian and Stewie adventure episode, with the added element of Mort Goldman, a Jewish character, being present as they moved through it. The episode does not pretend the setting is casual. It acknowledges directly what is happening around the characters. There are jokes about Nazis, about the specific mechanics of what Brian and Stewie have to do to get documents and find their way home, about the danger Mort is in as a Jewish man in Nazi-occupied Poland. Some of the humor comes from the show's usual approach to historical material, using the gap between the cartoon characters' modern sensibility and the historical setting as a source of comedy. Brian and Stewie know what they are looking at in a way that the people around them do not, and that knowledge gap generates some of the episode's humor. But Mort is there. That is the detail that sat uneasily with critics and with many viewers. Mort Goldman is a Jewish character. His family members, had they been real people in Warsaw in September 1939, would have been among the people being rounded up, imprisoned, and eventually murdered in the months and years that followed. The show did not ignore this. It made jokes about it. Mort's presence in Nazi-occupied Poland, his visibility as a Jewish man in a place where being a Jewish man was becoming more dangerous by the hour, was part of the episode's comedic material. The question that critics returned to repeatedly was what it meant to use Mort as comedy material in that specific setting. The show was not making jokes about the Nazis, or not primarily. It was putting a Jewish character into the Holocaust setting and generating comedy from his presence there. That is a different thing. Satire that mocks the perpetrators of historical atrocities is one category of humor. Comedy that places a victim, or a character coded as a victim, into the setting of an atrocity and uses his vulnerability vulnerability and his fear as entertainment material is another category. The episode moved between both without appearing to fully recognize that it was doing so. The reception to the episode was genuinely split in a way that most Family Guy controversies were not. A significant number of fans and critics considered it one of the better Road to episodes, praising the ambition of the setting, the quality of the Brian and Stewie dynamic, and the genuine creativity of some of the set pieces. The episode had real craftsmanship in it. The animation of the wartime setting was detailed, the plotting was more structured than many Family Guy episodes. People who wanted to defend it had real material to work with. But a significant number of critics and commentators pushed back on the fundamental premise. The argument was not that the episode was badly made. It was that the Holocaust is a specific category of historical event that operates differently from other dark historical material, and that the combination of placing a Jewish character inside it and using that placement for comedic effect crossed a line that the show's usual defenses did not adequately cover. Seth MacFarlane's broader relationship with Nazi humor gave the episode additional context that was hard to ignore. At the 2013 Academy Awards, which MacFarlane hosted, he made a joke during the opening segment that referenced Nazis. The joke was not about Road to Germany specifically, but it fit a pattern that critics had noticed. MacFarlane reached for Nazi-related humor more than once across his career, in different contexts, and the pattern suggested that this was not an accidental or isolated choice. Road to Germany was part of a body of work that included Holocaust and Nazi references appearing regularly enough to constitute a habit rather than a single, bold swing. The episode also came out in 2008, which was a specific moment in American cultural conversation about what was and was not acceptable in comedy. The country was in the middle of a period of significant debate about the limits of humor, about whether comedy could inoculate itself from responsibility by claiming it was just a joke, about who got to make certain kinds of jokes about certain kinds of subjects, about whether the people most affected by historical atrocities had a different relationship to comedy about those atrocities than people who were not affected. Road to Germany landed in the middle of all of that, without appearing to have thought carefully about where it was landing. What the episode reveals about Family Guy's approach to historical material is something the show had demonstrated before, but never quite this directly. The show's theory of comedy was that no subject was off limits, that treating some topics as sacred or untouchable was a form of dishonesty, and that the best way to handle dark history was to drag it into the cartoon world and refuse to treat it with the kind of reverent distance that made people feel comfortable. That theory had produced genuinely interesting television at various points. It had also produced moments where the refusal to treat something with any reverence flattened the thing being depicted into nothing more than a backdrop for jokes. The Holocaust is not a backdrop. That is not a sentimental statement. It is a factual one. Approximately 6 million Jewish people were murdered in a systematic and deliberate campaign across Europe between 1941 and 1945. Warsaw, the specific city the episode drops its characters into, lost the majority of its Jewish population. The people who lived in Warsaw in September 1939 and who were still alive when the war ended were the exceptions. Using that city, in that month, in that year, as the setting for a Brian and Stewie road trip comedy with a Jewish character along for the ride required the show to either engage seriously with what that setting meant or to treat it as just a location. Road to Germany chose the second option more than the first, and the discomfort that followed came from exactly that choice. The episode is still available. It still airs in reruns. It is still listed among the better Road to episodes by a portion of the fan base that evaluates it primarily on the strength of its structure and its Brian and Stewie dynamic. The critical discomfort around it has not disappeared, but it has also not prevented the episode from being part of the show's regular rotation. Family Guy's relationship with the episode is the same as its relationship with most of its controversial material. It exists, it aired, and the show moved on, without any particular accounting for the questions it raised. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Some of the show's most examined moments are the ones involving real people who were still alive when the jokes were made. Real people who could respond, who could be hurt in real time, who could make public statements about what had been done to them. One of those people was a beloved actor who had been fighting a serious illness for decades and had become one of the most prominent public voices about that illness, and Family Guy made him the punchline of a joke that his own creator later admitted should never have been made. Not in a Reddit comment, not in a passing interview. In the one moment Seth MacFarlane chose when given the chance to name his single biggest regret across everything Family Guy
Guy had ever produced.
Section 9. The JFK Pez dispenser. The joke Seth MacFarlane publicly regretted. There is a moment in season 1 of Family Guy that lasts about 5 seconds. It is not a musical number. It is not an extended scene. It is not a storyline built across an entire episode. It is a quick sight gag in a cutaway. The kind of joke the show produces dozens of times per episode. The kind of moment that most viewers absorb and forget before the next scene has even started. It does not involve a real person being depicted directly. It does not use anyone's name in a song. It does not mock anyone's illness or disability or death in explicit detail. By the standards of what Family Guy had done before and after it, the JFK Pez dispenser joke is not even close to the most extreme thing the show ever put on screen. And yet, when Seth MacFarlane was given the opportunity in 2017 to name the one moment from Family Guy's entire history that he wished he could take back, not a top 5, not a category of jokes, but the single, specific moment he most regretted, he named this one. That fact alone makes the joke worth examining carefully, not because of what it is on the surface, but because of what it reveals about where the line actually is, according to the person who spent decades drawing it. The episode is Season 1, Episode 5. It is called A Hero Sits Next Door, and it aired in May 1999, only a few months after the show first premiered. Family Guy was brand new at this point. It was still finding its voice, still figuring out what kind of show it was going to be, still testing the edges of what it could do and what Fox would allow. The episode's main plot involves Peter's new neighbor, a man named Joe Swanson, who is a police officer in a wheelchair and who quickly becomes the neighborhood hero in a way that makes Peter feel overshadowed. The Joe Swanson character would go on to become a fixture of the show for the rest of its run. Inside the episode, there is a cutaway scene. A child is playing with a John F. Kennedy Pez dispenser, a candy dispenser shaped like the head of President Kennedy. While the child is playing with it, the dispenser is accidentally shot, and the top of the candy dispenser, the part shaped like Kennedy's head, explodes. The child looks at the broken dispenser for a moment, and then reaches into his pocket and pulls out another one. This second dispenser is shaped like Robert F. Kennedy, the president's brother. The joke is complete. The scene moves on. John F. Kennedy was the 35th president of the United States. He was assassinated on November 22nd, 1963, in Dallas, Texas. He was shot in the head while riding in a motorcade through the city. He was 46 years old. Robert F. Kennedy was his younger brother, a senator from New York who was running for president himself in 1968. Robert F. Kennedy was assassinated on June 5th, 1968, in Los Angeles, California, shortly after winning the California presidential primary. He was 42 years old. Both men were shot in the head. Both deaths were national traumas of the highest order, events that changed the country, that are still discussed and analyzed and mourned decades later, that remain among the most painful moments in American political history. The joke uses both of those deaths as its punchline. The first Pez dispenser being shot in the head is a reference to JFK's assassination. The child pulling out the Bobby Kennedy dispenser as a replacement is a reference to the fact that Bobby Kennedy was also assassinated. The comedy, such as it is, comes from the casual stacking of two presidential assassinations, one on top of the other. The sheer audacity of the combination, delivered quickly and without ceremony, as though the deaths of two beloved public figures were just the setup for a visual gag about candy dispensers. In 1999, when the episode aired, the Kennedy assassinations were 36 years and 31 years in the past, respectively. They were historical events, but they were not ancient history. People who had been alive in 1963 and 1968 and had lived through both deaths were still very much alive in 1999. Members of the Kennedy family were still prominent in American public life. The grief around both deaths, while softened by the passage of time, had not disappeared. The Kennedy family remained one of the most recognizable and most discussed families in American political culture. And Family Guy, in its 5th episode, used the manner of both men's deaths as the structure for a quick candy dispenser joke. The show was 17 weeks old when this aired. It had not yet developed the track record that would later allow it to argue that its dark humor served a larger purpose, that its willingness to go into uncomfortable places produced something worthwhile, that the audience understood the spirit in which the material was offered. It was a brand new cartoon on Fox, and one of its first major dark jokes was about two presidential assassinations delivered as a 5-second sight gag. The Reddit AMA happened in 2017. AMA stands for Ask Me Anything, and it is a format where public figures make themselves available to answer questions from regular people online. Seth MacFarlane participated in one, and someone asked him directly, "Is there a Family Guy scene you regret?" MacFarlane had 18 years of material to look back on at that point. 18 years of jokes that had caused protests, triggered lawsuits, been pulled from air, generated formal complaints from organizations representing people with serious illnesses, prompted real families to contact Fox and ask for the show to be canceled. He had the AIDS barbershop quartet. He had the Terri Schiavo musical. He had Road to Germany and the Holocaust setting and Mort Goldman. He had Turban Cowboy and the Boston Marathon. He had years of Meg abuse and the Screams of Silence episode and the domestic violence that critics had cataloged across consecutive seasons. He named the JFK Pez dispenser. His exact words, as reported from the AMA, were that he could do without the JFK Pez dispenser scene. Brief, direct, without elaboration. He did not explain his reasoning in detail.
He did not write a paragraph about why this particular moment crossed a line he had not crossed elsewhere. He simply named it as the thing he would remove if he could go back. The question of why this moment, out of everything, is the one that has stayed with him is genuinely interesting. The most obvious answer is the one about the Kennedy family still being alive and still being part of American public life. Joking about the manner of John F. Kennedy's death in 1999 meant joking about something that living people were still carrying. The Kennedy family had not become a historical abstraction. They were real people in the real world, and the specific detail of the assassination, the headshot, the motorcade, the moment that was filmed and has been watched and studied and grieved over for decades, was not the kind of material that had become safe through the passage of time. There is also something specific about what the joke does with the deaths. A lot of dark humor about historical tragedies uses the tragedy as context. It sets the scene and then says something about the people involved, or about the culture around the event, or about the way history works. The JFK Pez dispenser joke does not do any of that. It does not say anything about Kennedy, or about his presidency, or about the impact of his death, or about what it meant to the country. The assassination is purely structural. The death of a president is being used as a mechanism, the thing that makes the candy dispenser's head pop off. And the second death is the punchline that proves the show is willing to use both. There is no content beneath the surface of the joke. There is only the audacity of making it at all. That is a particular kind of humor that can feel very different depending on where you are sitting. From inside the writing room, the JFK Pez dispenser joke probably felt like the ultimate test of the show's willingness to go anywhere. A quick, unexpected jab at one of the most sacred subjects in American political memory, delivered without apology or build-up. From outside the writing room, from the position of someone who cared about the Kennedy family, or who had grown up with the weight of those assassinations as part of their understanding of the country, it probably felt like something was being treated as worthless that was not worthless. McFarlane's regret, expressed 18 years later, suggests he eventually landed closer to the second position than the first. Not because he had become more conservative about comedy, or less willing to go into dark territory, his entire career is evidence against that reading, but because something about this specific joke, about the specific combination of two presidential assassinations, used purely as a mechanism for a 5-second cutaway, with no other point, did not sit right with him when he looked back at it across the distance of nearly 2 decades. What makes the regret significant is what it reveals about how the show's creator understood the difference between dark comedy that does something and dark comedy that is only dark. McFarlane has never walked back the AIDS joke in any meaningful way. He has not expressed regret about the Holocaust episode or the Schiavo musical in any public forum. But the JFK Pez dispenser, the quick, structurally simple, 5-second joke about 2 assassinated presidents, was the one that stuck. The one that, when given the chance to name his biggest regret, he named. That tells you something about where the line is. Even for a man who has spent his career drawing it further out than almost anyone else on television, the line is not always where the loudest protests are. It is not always where the organizations file their formal complaints or where the networks issue their nervous statements. Sometimes the line is a quieter thing, a moment that does not generate the most outrage, but that the person who made it knows in some part of themselves that the public defenses never quite reach should not have been made. Family Guy has produced an enormous amount of dark material across its run. Most of it was defended, most of it was not regretted, and most of the people who made it would make it again given the chance. The JFK Pez dispenser is the exception. 5 seconds in season 1. The thing the creator wished he could take back. __quote_16__. And then there is the subject that the show spent 20 years using as a punchline before finally, in 2019, standing in front of its own audience and admitting it was going to stop. Not because anyone forced them to, not because they were sued or banned or protested into it, because they looked at what they had been doing and decided on their own that it was time to be done.
done with it. That admission, and everything it implied about the 2 decades that came before it, is the last piece of the story this video has been building toward. Section 10. Family Guy phases out gay jokes and admits they went too far for years. There is a specific kind of admission that is harder than an apology. An apology says, I did something wrong and I am sorry. That is difficult. It requires humility and it requires acknowledging harm. But there is something even more difficult than that. Something that requires a different kind of honesty altogether. It is the admission that goes like this. I have been doing something wrong for a very long time, and I knew enough about the world to have known better. And I am going to stop now. That admission does not just cover one moment or one episode or one joke that went too far. It covers years. It covers hundreds of individual decisions made by dozens of writers across season after season of television. It covers the entire architecture of a running joke that was never just a joke. In January 2019, Family Guy made that admission on screen, inside the show itself, in front of its own audience. The episode is called Trump Guy. It is season 17, episode 9, and it aired on January 13th, 2019. The main plot involves the Griffin family moving to Washington, D.C., where Peter gets a job as a reporter and ends up having to follow a cartoon version of President Donald Trump. The episode is a political satire piece, which was not unusual for Family Guy by that point in the show's run. What was unusual happened in a scene where Peter Griffin speaks directly to the cartoon Trump character and tells him, plainly, that the show has been trying to phase out gay jokes. The line was not a throwaway. It was not buried inside a cutaway gag where it could be read as the character speaking rather than the show speaking. It was a direct, clear, in-the-moment statement delivered by the show's main character to another character with no comedic frame around it that would allow a viewer to dismiss it as just Peter being Peter. The show was telling its audience something about itself. It was acknowledging, inside its own fiction, that it had been doing something it was now choosing to stop doing. Seth MacFarlane confirmed the change publicly, alongside executive producers Alex Solkin and Rich Appel. Their explanation was consistent across the interviews they gave around that time. The world had changed. Attitudes toward gay people had shifted significantly in American society over the 2 decades the show had been on the air. Jokes that had existed in a particular cultural context in 1999 existed in a completely different cultural context in 2019. What had once been treated as edgy and provocative had become something that a large portion of the audience and a large portion of the people working on the show recognized as harmful. The show wanted to reflect where the culture actually was, rather than where it had been when it started. To understand what this admission covered, you have to understand what Family Guy had actually done with gay characters and gay jokes across its run. The show had used male homosexuality as a punchline in hundreds of episodes across 17 seasons. The structure of these jokes was almost always the same. A male character, usually Peter or one of the other men in the show's world, would end up in a situation that could be read as gay. Physical contact with another man, an expression of affection toward another man, an accidental encounter that suggested intimacy, and the comedy would come from the character's horrified reaction to that situation. The horror was the punchline. The idea that being gay, or being perceived as gay, was something to be disgusted by and to run away from as fast as possible. That was the engine the jokes ran on. Peter Griffin reacted with revulsion to situations coded as gay throughout the show's run, in ways that the show presented as normal and funny. Stewie's sexuality was a recurring source of jokes that operated on the assumption that there was something comic about the idea of a character being gay. Quagmire, the show's self-described womanizer, had a storyline in season 9 involving his father transitioning to a woman, and the episode's handling of that subject received extensive criticism for treating both the transition and the relationship between Quagmire and his father with the same casual dismissiveness that the show applied to gay characters generally. The Parents Television Council, the same organization that had filed formal complaints with the FCC about the show's content over the years, had specifically targeted the gay joke content in its complaints. The organization filed formal paperwork arguing that the show's depiction of gay characters and its use of homosexuality as a punchline constituted content that violated standards of decency. The PTC's complaints did not succeed in getting the content removed or the show penalized by the FCC, but they were part of a pattern of documented, formal objections to this specific element of the show's humor that stretched back years. What makes the 2019 decision significant is not just that the show stopped making the jokes. It is that the show chose to announce that it was stopping inside the show itself in a way that its audience would see and hear directly. The writers could have simply stopped writing gay jokes without comment. They could have have let the change happen quietly, episode by episode, without drawing attention to it. Many shows make content changes over time without explicitly naming what they are doing and why. Family Guy chose to name it. Peter Griffin told a cartoon version of the sitting president of the United States that the show was phasing out gay jokes. That is a specific, deliberate, public-facing choice. The decision to make the announcement inside the Trump Guy episode was itself meaningful. By 2019,
the show's relationship with political content had become more explicit and more pointed than it had been in earlier seasons. Putting the gay joke announcement inside a political episode signaled that the show understood the decision as connected to something larger than just a comedy preference, that it was a statement about values, about what the show stood for, and what it was willing to put its name on going forward. Alex Sulkin, one of the executive producers who confirmed the change, had his own personal connection to the subject that added context. In 2010, Sulkin had posted a tweet in the immediate aftermath of the earthquake that devastated Haiti, making a joke about the disaster and Haitian people. The tweet was deleted, and he apologized for it. The incident was noted in coverage of the 2019 gay joke announcement as part of a pattern of people connected to Family Guy reckoning with the gap between what they had found acceptable to say in the past and what they recognized as harmful in the present. The critical response to the announcement was divided in a way that reflected a genuine tension in how people thought about the change. Some critics and commentators praised the decision as a long overdue acknowledgement that the show had caused real harm, with a sustained pattern of jokes that treated gay identity as something inherently comic and inherently lesser. These responses pointed out that Family Guy had reached enormous audiences across its run, that its humor had shaped how many of its viewers thought about gay people, and that hundreds of episodes of gay panic jokes had consequences that extended beyond the television screen into real attitudes held by real people in the real world. Other responses were more skeptical. Critics who had spent years documenting the show's problematic content pointed out that announcing you were going to stop doing something harmful was not the same as accounting for the harm you had already done. The show did not apologize to the gay community for 20 years of jokes built on the premise that homosexuality was something to be horrified by. It did not acknowledge specifically what the impact of those jokes might have been. It said it was going to stop, and it framed the stopping as a response to changing times, rather than as a recognition of a past wrong. The distinction mattered to people who had been on the receiving end of that humor for 2 decades. There is also a question about what phasing out means in practice, and whether the change was as complete as the announcement suggested. The show has continued to air since 2019. Critics and viewers have noted that while the most explicit versions of the gay panic jokes became less frequent, the show's overall approach to the subject did not transform overnight. Change at the scale the announcement implied, across a writing staff, across the established rhythms of how a show generates its material, across the deep grooves worn into the show's identity by 17 years of a particular kind of humor, does not happen immediately just because an announcement is made on screen. What the announcement did do, regardless of how complete or incomplete the actual change proved to be, was force a reckoning with the timeline. If the jokes were wrong enough to stop in 2019, they were wrong in 2015, and in 2010, and in 2005, and in 1999. The decision to phase them out did not create a line between an acceptable past and an unacceptable present. It drew a line in 2019 and implicitly acknowledged that everything before that line should be looked at differently. The show did not say this explicitly, but the logic of the decision made it unavoidable. Family Guy premiered in January 1999. The gay joke announcement aired in January 2019. That is exactly 20 years. 20 years of an audience watching a show that used homosexuality as a punchline, that built recurring gags on the idea that being perceived as gay was horrifying, that treated gay identity as a reliable source of cheap comedy in episode after episode after episode. 20 years of that material reaching tens of millions of viewers across its original airings and its syndicated reruns and its streaming availability. 20 years before the show stood in front of its audience and said it was going to stop. The 10 moments covered in this video are not random. They are not just a list of times Family Guy made people uncomfortable. They are a map of something. They trace the outline of a show that understood, at various points and in various ways, that it had crossed lines it should not have crossed, and that dealt with that understanding differently each time. Sometimes it defended what it did. Sometimes it said nothing at all. Sometimes it was banned from doing it again by outside forces.
Once, the creator named his own biggest regret, and once, after 20 years, the show itself stood up and said that something it had been doing for a very long time was something it was now going to stop. None of those responses are the same thing. They do not add up to a single clean story about a show that learned from its mistakes, or a show that never learned anything. They add up to something more complicated and more honest than either of those. A show that lived on the edge of what was acceptable for 25 years, that sometimes fell over that edge and sometimes pulled back from it, that made people laugh and made people hurt and made people protest and made one creator quietly admit to something he wished he could undo. That is the real story of Family Guy and the jokes that went too far. Not just that they went too far, but what happened after and what that tells us about where the line actually is and who gets to draw it and what it costs when it gets drawn in the wrong place. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.